Good afternoon and welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar on the impact of COVID on mental health, brought to you by Homewood Health. I'm Jonathan Avery, and I'm the National Vice President of Sales and Account Management, and I have the pleasure of working with our teams and their customers across the country every day. Allow me to tell you a bit about your facilitator today, Dr. Sandra Primiano. Dr. Primiano is the Senior Director of the Homewood Clinics and Homewood du Plateau. Dr. Primiano provides leadership to the Homewood Outpatient Clinics and Homewood du Plateau, where she collaborates with our clinical leaders to deliver the high quality and clinical effectiveness of our facilities and services. Dr. Primiano also acts as Health Psychology Discipline Lead, working closely with Homewood's Human Resources in consulting on psychologist roles and responsibilities, including training and professional development needs, and provides leadership of the discipline. Sandra graduated from the Université du Québec at Montréal with a PhD and a PsyD in clinical and experimental psychology, and came to Homewood from Veterans Affairs Canada, where she was a psychology consultant for the Directorate of Mental Health.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really my pleasure to be able to take some time to talk about some important mental health issues and concerns, and then hopefully have some time for questions. So what we want to look at is really some of the unique challenges that are brought upon us by the pandemic. And so a lot of this is related to the change that it's created, and change can cause a lot of instability for all of us and uncertainty, and especially for people who already might have issues or symptoms of anxiety and depression. This can be definitely more challenging due to the current situation that has a lot of uncertainty, social isolation, many unexpected changes that affect our routine, our relationships, our work and home environments, and this can be especially difficult for some people. So I want to look at some of these topics in terms of COVID, depression and anxiety, some prevalence statistics, some signs and symptoms, and then looking at strategies, what might be helpful for you and your loved ones at this time. So really, I think some key priorities here are being able to increase awareness concerning symptoms of depression and anxiety, to understand why it's important to recognize them, and in ourselves and in others, and look at some strategies, so things that we can implement right away in our lives at this point and during the pandemic and beyond that could be helpful for you. So most of us know what the symptoms are. We see this all over the news and the media. And so for most people, like I was saying, the uncertainty that we experience during this time, combined with a sense of loss of control, really makes it quite challenging. So in order to really try to better manage the uncertainty and the unknown, we want to increase our sense of control. And so in order to do this, we want to rely on credible sources and follow best practices. That's the best way to manage what we're feeling when faced with any kind of uncertainty or fear, is to arm ourselves with the right kind of knowledge and information. So we really do want to focus on the things that we know that are evidence-based to keep ourselves safe. And with all the different amounts of information and misinformation, we need to focus on credible sources. And so the part here, psychologically speaking, that's important is when we have misinformation, it can lead to more fear and anxiety. And that's why we want to focus on facts and what we know to be true. When we don't have information or we have questions, we tend to fill in the gaps by creating stories. And these stories are based on our own personal biases. For instance, if we're anxious, we tend to create more catastrophic or exaggerated kind of scenarios when we hear something that we're not sure of or we're missing information. I don't know, for example, thinking that you heard that somebody caught COVID from a dog that barked that you walked by. Like, there's just so many pieces of misinformation that are causing more stress for people. So we really need to focus on what we know and limit it in that way. So the takeaway here for me that I think is really important for everybody to understand is COVID is really something that's caused a lot of change in our life. Essentially, it is change. And change can be really destabilizing because it leads to uncertainty, worry, it can lead to anxiety over time. And so the pandemic in many ways, like we touched on previously, has changed our routines, our jobs, our relationships, our sense of safety and security, our health and well-being, just to name a few things. So, and change, whether it's good or bad, whether it's getting married or losing a job, it's a stressor. And a stressor is anything that's going to place extra demand on our resources, whether that's cognitively, physically, emotionally. And we're going to react to this physically and emotionally, and this can cause anxiety over time. So typically, if there's stress and then it's over, we have a presentation and then it's done, that tends to resolve itself. But a constant state of stress over time it will cause our bodies to react, and we're going to have certain symptoms and reactions. So we'll talk about that as we move into speaking about anxiety. And so I just want to highlight here, so anxiety really is very normal. It's a universal human experience. It actually protects us because it acts as an alarm system when there's a dangerous situation. And so it's an important physiological and emotional reaction, and it can happen to perceived threat or danger. And that's whether it's real or imagined. So that's what's important here is perceived threat. So really, I just want to touch on the difference between fear and anxiety. So fear is really a punctual reaction when there's a real danger. So when the danger is removed, our system goes back to normal, and we feel normal again. Like if you were walking down the street and almost got hit by a car, you'd experience fear. So this evolved, right, in us to keep ourselves safe. If we were to imagine our ancestors who came across some kind of animal in the wild, you would need fear to mobilize yourself to run away or to fight or, have a reaction, or else you'd be eaten. So the problem is when the alarm system keeps going on and there's no real danger. So anxiety is more of that reaction that persists over time in the absence of any real danger. So it's the same response, and our body is going to react in the same way as it would when there's a real danger. So the threat can be imagined, and it can, in the case of anxiety, can take the form of worry. And worry, as you know, can be about many different scenarios. What happens if I never go back to work? What if my kids don't go back to school? What if I never see my loved ones again? These are examples of different scenarios that we might think of that are examples of worry. So when if you notice that you're saying what would happen, what if, we're in a worry cycle, and we want to break that. And we can talk a bit more about that as we move forward. So briefly, depression, we can see it as a prolonged reaction to stress, loss over time. We can feel sad, discouraged, unmotivated, disinterested. And an interesting hypothesis that I liked in evolutionary psychology is that depression was thought of as a way to solicit support from a social group. If we look unable to care for ourselves, we may solicit aid. But what I really, as a takeaway, what I want you to think of here is the sadness and depressive type of thinking really changes the way our brains work. It reinforces certain neural networks, connections in our brain, and our pattern of thought over time. And so over time, these connections become reinforced and easier for us to solicit. So if I just ask you quickly to think of something you dislike about yourselves, something likely has popped into mind. And then if I ask you to think of something that you like about yourselves, for example, that might take a little bit longer. And that's most likely because we're highly critical in our society, And we often lack self-compassion in Western cultures and society. And so we think a lot more about what we don't like about ourselves and how we criticize ourselves. And then that's much easier to solicit than it is a quality or something that you like about yourself. And so in the same way, if we're constantly reinforcing negative ideas, thought patterns, they're stronger. It's like, think about it like a muscle that you exercise. So it becomes stronger and easier to activate. And then that kind of thinking can lead to depression over time. Here, I just briefly want to touch on something that's quite astounding. If you just think of the population of Canada, what percentage, if you had to guess, have diabetes, depression, and anxiety? How many would regain function after treatment? How many would actually receive evidence-based treatment? Like if you had to just guess about it in your minds. Well, I'll let you know. So what we see is 3.5 million, about 10% of the population have diabetes. Depression and anxiety is 4 million. It's actually a bit more than diabetes. It's just as current, more current actually than that kind of health issue. 3/4 of people, which is fantastic, really do improve when they receive an evidence-based treatment. So that's fantastic news. We know that most people will recover, regain functioning with the proper help and support. However, less than 20% about receive an evidence-informed or evidence-based treatment. And so that's really important to consider. So it's amazing news that we can get better, but we need adequate treatment to get better. And so we have to focus on the things we know, and that comes from research. And so when, looking at different approaches and practices, it's really important to consider what is based on research. And so just as a quick takeaway, these mental health issues are very important and significant health issues in our society. And what's very interesting here is that they're often concurrent. And so I like this topic because actually my PhD focused on the treatment of comorbid or co-occurring anxiety disorders. And so what we do see is that they often overlap, and we develop multiple issues at the same time. And that's because a lot of the symptoms and different ways that we start to think and feel and behave have common underlying aspects. And so what's great about that is what we see is we can develop treatments that address more than one issue at the same time. We can develop adequate treatments for depression and anxiety or symptoms of both at the same time. So by understanding some of the underlying causes and issues, we can treat both. And they're so related because, for instance, it can go either way. Feeling anxious over time can lead you to start feeling depressed because things aren't improving, things aren't getting better. You might feel anxiety or panic when you leave the house, and then that becomes depressing over time to think, why am I not getting better? Why do I feel like this? And so that could feed into depression, or feeling depressed over time can lead you to start feeling anxious because you're not feeling good, you're unhappy, you may think others are judging you, you may be highly critical of yourself and not want to leave the house and start to feel anxiety and experience avoidance. So they're highly related in these ways and often coexist together. So not only are they extremely current, but they're also concurrent, they exist together. So briefly here, I just wanted to touch on the fact that symptoms of anxiety, really we see physical, cognitive, and behavioral symptoms. And I talked a bit about the cognitive part, the what if catastrophic thinking type of worries, and a lot of what we see physically, if we think of a panic attack or just feeling a state of anxiety, we have an increased heart rate and tension, difficulty breathing. And there can be various emotions that are associated with anxiety, but also with other issues as well. So there's some overlap there. There are many different anxiety disorders. A couple of these, in the new way that we classify them, are no longer under anxiety disorders. For example, obsessive compulsive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder are in different categories. But briefly, what's important, so some of the most common ones would be panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and social anxiety disorder. And people can, so part of panic disorder are panic attacks. And what happens when you develop panic disorder is that they become frequent, and people start avoiding places that may be associated or things that may be associated with a panic attack. And panic attacks can be experienced in a number of different disorders and issues. Like someone with social anxiety can experience a panic attack when they have to speak in public or in a social gathering. So panic attacks, really, they can come out of nowhere, typically, and they're accompanied with a number of physiological type of symptoms like a rapid heart rate, sweating, dizziness, vertigo. And they happen for a discrete period of time, let's say between 2 to 5 minutes with a peak, and then things tend to resolve themselves. And what happens is there's a conditioning. People become afraid of the symptoms that they're feeling. And that's why we refer to panic disorder often as the fear of fear, because we're so afraid of those symptoms that we're actually triggering then the panic attack in ourselves because we're panicking about the symptoms that we're feeling. So what's important in a cognitive behavioral approach is to desensitize people, to provide psychoeducation, to explain what's happening, and then desensitize them to the symptoms. So to touch on depression, there are also various physical, cognitive, behavioral, emotional type of symptoms, and they really reinforce themselves and create sort of like a pattern of reactions in people. For example, if you are not feeling good about yourself and you feel depressed and that sense of worthlessness, then you might avoid people, and then by avoiding people, you've limited your interactions and you've changed your behavior, which then could reinforce further the ideas of you being worthless and alone and feeling sad. So we need to break the cycle by acting on different components in it. And that's what we do in cognitive behavioral therapy, is we try to work on different components of it. For example, if we work on a behavioral component, if you take the dog out for a walk, you might feel more accomplished and think more positively and then feel happier. So that's what's good, is that we can act on different components. Just to mention, there are various types of depressive disorders. Our mood fluctuates. That's normal. It's when there's extreme highs, extreme lows, or constant lows that then we might have an issue. And so the difference between something normal and abnormal is really when we look at the frequency, how pervasive it is, and whether it affects our functioning, right? So if a symptom is around more than it's not around, and it affects the way that we are able to function, then it can become an issue. But we all have emotions. Emotions are normal. We have the right to experience them. And the best thing we can do is become aware of them, make room for them, process them, talk about them, and they will leave as they came. It's when we start to fight ourselves that we run into issues. Like, if I'm saying, don't think about a pink elephant, everybody, try not to think about a pink elephant for 5 minutes. You've probably already conjured up the pink elephant. It's impossible. So in that same way, we don't want to fight our emotions. We want to welcome them and accept them and not fuse to them and think that we are our emotions, but just make room for them and not be afraid of them. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about strategies. So supporting ourselves, and others is really important during this time. As we talked about, there are many changes that are stressful for us. We need to be able to check in with ourselves and with others to get a sense of how we're doing and how others are doing. And some general strategies that will help, because what we're seeing is an increase actually in anxiety. So worry is a component of anxiety, depression, and substance use in Canadians, particularly alcohol, all age groups, a little bit less in the, I think it was 50s to 60 range, but our alcohol use has increased a lot. And so one thing that I think is really helpful is self-compassion. And I briefly mentioned in Western society, we're really hard on ourselves. We tend to be critical. And that only increases anxious and depressive symptoms. So by practicing being kinder and more accepting of ourselves, it will actually help with our anxiety and depression or, symptoms of. Even if we didn't get all the work done that we wanted to, for example, or we didn't feel like we were being the perfect parent and the perfect employee, instead of being hard on ourselves and criticizing ourselves, we can treat ourselves with kindness and say, I did my best, I'm doing my best. I did work hard and I did accomplish some things, and my kids are doing their curriculum the best they can and they're safe, and focus on what we're doing well instead of being so mean to ourselves. And even if we did something that wasn't great, we can still be kind to ourselves and say like, hey, I really messed up, and that's okay too, because that happens. And so the way to think about self-compassion is, what would you say to somebody that you loved or your best friend when they messed up? What would you say? How would you treat them, or your child? And we need to apply that to ourselves, to talk to ourselves in the same way, with the same love and kindness. And what's really interesting about this is, even on a physical level, if we're able to stroke our arm or give ourselves a hug or be kind to ourselves even physically, what research shows is we release the attachment hormone oxytocin, which is a hormone that we have, we think, to create bonds and attachment. Pregnant women will release a lot of oxytocin to bond with their babies. And we think that this evolved to be able to care for our young. And it's a hormone that is a feel-good hormone that is associated with a better mood and calmness. And so we want oxytocin, and actually being kind to ourselves allows us to release it. A great book on self-compassion is called Self-Compassion by Kristen Neff, if anybody wants to read about it. I really like that book. We can limit our social media and news intake. I would really encourage, like I touched on, practicing awareness and acceptance of emotions. We need to make room for them, allow them to exist. Don't fight them. Remember the pink elephant. They will just be even stronger and more present. Talk about them, journal them. It's okay to feel bad. It's okay to feel sad. And I think, we're so critical to say, I shouldn't feel bad. I have a job, or, I'm fine at home. Why do I feel so bad? Well, you have a reason for feeling bad, and understanding it and supporting yourself will get you further than criticizing. Also, we know that gratitude is a really important behavior that increases happiness. And you can express gratitude really in any way, whether it be just acknowledging something that you appreciated in the day, or keeping a journal. And it is a habit of happy people. If ever you do want to read about that, The How of Happiness is a really good book, and a research evidence-based book on why people are happier than others. And basically, it talks a lot about that. And gratitude is a habit of happy people. So this is interesting. If ever you want to have a look at this, it is Chris Hadfield's outline, who outlines steps to thrive and be productive while being isolated. So there's a nice video there that's interesting. And what he summarizes is really understanding actual risk and referring to credible sources. I had mentioned that at the beginning. That helps with anxiety, is to focus on what we know, the things that we know. Identifying what we want to accomplish, goals and routines, super important, constraints and obligations, and action and taking action, if you want to check that out. This is the CBT model that I mentioned before, and just really looking at the way the different facets interact that we can have an effect on, either cognitively, the way we think. We can restructure or question our thinking. We can intervene behaviorally and sort of push ourselves into action, which can help our mood. So sometimes the cart comes before the horse. We may not feel motivated to exercise, but if we force ourselves to exercise or walk, we may actually feel better after. So just wanted to go back to that briefly. And so talking about CBT, so it is an evidence-informed, evidence-based practice, and really it is understanding the connection between thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And it does require practice, change is hard. So I would encourage people to try what works best for them. Not always the same for everybody, whether it's acting more on thoughts, understanding behaviors, or trying to activate ourselves behaviorally. So a big part of CBT is getting informed. So psychoeducation, understanding what it is I'm feeling, why am I feeling this way, modifying the way that we're thinking, because we have biases in how we think depending on our own personal histories and backgrounds. So we want to be mindful of that, and we want to pick up on when we're thinking in that way. And then emotional management strategies. So this is the empowering through information, the psychoeducational piece over there, and recognizing symptoms is being able to monitor exactly what we're feeling, our moods, our anxiety, and acting like a scientist, sort of trying to look at what makes it better and what makes it worse. And understanding different facts and information about what it is that we're going through. So it's in a similar way, arming ourselves through information so that we can better manage things. So in terms of negative or biased types of thinking, and we all do this, and we do some more than others depending on who we are. We tend to think in all or nothing kind of ways, jump to conclusions. We tend to be catastrophic in our thinking. For example, thinking like life will never go back to normal. We're all doomed. This situation, everything about it is terrible. We're catastrophizing. We're thinking in very black and white terms. So when we see that we're stuck in a biased way of thinking, we can question it. We can help ourselves. We can help ourselves by, well, first of all, taking some distance from our thoughts and saying, these are thoughts. I'm not going to fuse with them. It doesn't mean it's true. Like, don't take thoughts for facts. They're not facts. It's just what you're thinking. You are not your thoughts, as you are not your emotions. And I think that's really, really important, to not feeling overwhelmed by what we're thinking and or feeling. We need to take a step back. You are not your thoughts. You are not your emotions. And this is a technique it's a third wave of CBT, acceptance and commitment therapy. And it's so important. There's a great book on that too, The Happiness Trap, which really talks about all those strategies quite nicely. And we can look at our thoughts more with interest, and try to hypothesize about whether they're accurate or not. Like, is there another way to think about this? Like, am I missing some information? Like, what are my sources? Let me generate other possibilities, right? So that we get ourselves out of those kind of stuck ways of thinking. For emotions, it's really important to be able to do the same, to tolerate, to take space from our emotions, and to know that we are not our emotions. And I really want to emphasize here, emotions aren't good or bad. They're not. That's our judgment. There's some that are pleasant, maybe some that are more difficult to experience than others, but by judging our emotions or ourselves, we're making it harder for ourselves. So emotions are emotions, and in that way, we have to accept them, make room for them, understand why they're there. What are they trying to tell us? Because they're adaptive. There's something they're trying to tell us, and use that so that we can figure out what it is that we're feeling, and use self-compassion and self-soothing to try to help ourselves. And when we experience an extreme emotion, this definitely is a cue to take a step back. We don't want to make decisions when we're feeling intense emotions. We want to take a step back and observe what we're experiencing and try to understand it. We might want to take a break from it to try to figure out what's happening, or bring the emotion down a bit, so we can engage in some self-soothing kind of behavior to change our thoughts. We can listen to music we like, or we can eat something we like, or take a bath, or find a way, whatever we like, whatever we find soothing, pet our cat or our dog, to bring the tone of the emotion down so that we can think more rationally. When we're in a state of intense emotion, the more primitive part of our brain is involved, the amygdala, and we can go into a mode where we're not able to access our frontal lobes, which is what makes us different from other animals and is the biggest part of our brain that's most developed. And so that's involved in rational thinking. And when we're highly emotional, we cannot think properly. So we have to take a step back, find a way to bring the emotion down, and then figure out what it is we need to do. So routine, very, very important, especially when you're stuck at home, for instance. But you can still have a routine at this time, and you can actually plan your routine, every day of the week and make sure that it has these different components in it. Some physical activity, social connection, some gratitude, some way of giving back. And so we know that routines are incredibly helpful during this time to try to be more structured. And then all the basics. We want to sleep and eat, basic needs. And what's so great, if you're Canadian or if you're in Canada, there are different supports, and Wellness Together Canada is one of them that is available to you. And by calling this number, you can access free counseling support, which is fantastic for any kind of issues that you're having. And you can get resources from our counselors as well to help with that. So use the resources that you have. Absolutely, and Wellness Together is a great one. So just to wrap up, we talked about symptoms of anxiety and depression. We talked about the challenging times during the pandemic, how to recognize symptoms and support ourselves.
Thank you for tuning into this session. You can access additional resources at homewoodhealth.com/COVID-19. Or if you have any questions, please email connect@homewoodhealth.com and someone will get back to you.